so kindly said, without a guitar. I am Juan Andrés Guerrero-Saade. This is Brian Bartholomew, who's my partner in crime. And we're going to talk about false flags today. And let me take a minute just to say, thanks to SANS, and this is my first SANS as well, so I'm fairly excited to be here. But also, I'd like to change the tone a little bit because I've heard everybody be extremely encouraging over the past, day and a bit. And so it's great to bring everybody in, and especially people who are doing IR and DIFR in general, who might not be as familiar with threat intel generation. We want you guys to come on board. We want everybody to get into threat intel generation as best they can and consumption in a wise way, and not just data feeds, but actual context, and to be able to understand what these operations are, what they're doing. But there's also a thorny side to that. So I want to, kind of put a damper on the optimism just a little bit in order to get a sense of realism of some of the pitfalls that are out there, some of the troubles that are there. As we start this, just keep in mind there is a 22-page paper. I think they cut that down to 10 by formatting on this that we released a few months ago, just in case you want some more details or you want to actually get a sense of some of the specifics. But with that, for those of you that might not know, we are from the great team, from the Global Research and Analysis team at Kaspersky. You may have heard several jives at us yesterday. It's all in good fun. We have a lot of fun with it, and I'll be more than happy to show you my Rusklish accent after all this. Is very well practiced. But more importantly, what the great team does is specifically threat intel generation at a high level, and we get to have a lot of fun with it. We're tracking about upwards of 100 different threat actors, mostly on the espionage side right now. So for those of you that might not be familiar, this is more or less a tree of some of the discoveries starting from 2010. As you can see, it starts getting exponentially bigger, and that doesn't even include 2016 or 2017, where we've added a lot of new threat actors in there, and some fairly interesting ones that we no longer publicly discuss quite as easily, which is a little sad for me on the research end. But the point here is that we've been in the right place to kind of understand how attribution should and shouldn't be done. And we'd like to be able to focus on that instead of continuing to talk about the possibility of false flags and this sort of sense of you can't be sure of what you might be seeing because everything could be planted, because everything is not quite right, so you never really come up with an attribution claim. We're attribution agnostic. We're going to continue to be attribution agnostic for reasons that I think are going to become exceedingly clear as we talk about this. But that's not to say that you shouldn't understand the parameters within which you can do a certain amount of attribution, what you are basing it on, and where those specific things fail you. So let's get into the specifics. Let's get into the weeds and kind of work on that a little bit.
Let's start by talking about attribution and why it's an issue. So it was just mentioned the last two presentations actually about training. A lot of us come from, hopefully in this room, government background, intelligence background, or at least a good portion of us. In that world, a lot of us have received training on how to be intelligence analysts. Unfortunately, with the advent and the increase in private sector and vendors producing intelligence, we haven't actually created a good training curriculum for people on their onboarding to actually understand how to actually do attribution. So I know that's being done now, but it's in its infancy stages, major problem. Just to go through a couple other ones here, reputation I tend to kind of harp on a little bit. There's some vendors out there that feel like they need to build some street cred, and unfortunately, when they want to do this, they tend to go out and be a little lazy with their attribution claims. They don't back them up because it's sexy, right? They want the reputation. And the last one here about it not being a secret anymore, the bad guys, back in the day, we never talked about this stuff. Reports were produced, things were classified. Up until about 2006, 2007, cyber espionage in general just wasn't discussed in the open. Nowadays, it's commonplace to have these intel reports just published one after the other. And unfortunately, it's great information, but at the same time, the actors are actually consuming this as well. And they're taking this information and turning around and using it kind of against us and to throw us for some loops, and you'll see that in a minute.
So let me get a sense of the crowd a little bit. I've been kind of trying to study who's actually here over the past day. but how comfortable do you feel with how attribution is generally done? Like what it's based on? How many of you are maybe malware analysts or reverse engineers? How many of you would classify yourselves that way? I see a couple of hands going up. How many of you actually read some of the reports, some of the APT reports and so on? See a few more hands? All right. So I won't dig too deep into any of these, but just so you have an idea, anytime that you're seeing a decently substantiated attribution claim, which is to say not just some random startup or a cyber truther on Twitter deciding that it's, random person X, this is what it's being based on to some extent. You've got compilation timestamps. If it's Windows malware, you can actually see when it was compiled, which means that if you have a decent set of samples, you can actually create an activity timeline and say, if these guys are working 9 to 5, then they're likely working 9 to 5 in this general geographic region. You've got strings, which will usually give you a sense of what language these people might be speaking, or debug paths, which will ideally give you a user folder or some sense of, if they're very organized, which some developers are, they'll actually give you some internal names for their projects and how they actually go about some of these things. A lot of sloppy actors will leave resource languages in there. So, a lot of the Lazarus Group malware has Korean language resources in the malware. If you're in a point of good visibility, you will get a sense of tasking or targeting. Who are these people going after, who do they care to target, or who have they successfully victimized with this malware. And you can also look at, obviously, command and control infrastructure and how it's being reused. If you're in a lucky privileged position, you might see some back-end connections. How do they connect to these servers, from where? And then things that we're particularly fond of, malware families, how the code is being reused in order to develop that toolkit over time, or into different malware families or into entirely different operations. And every so often you get some password or encryption key reuse that might allow you to tie some things together. Now, for those of you that are more familiar with threat intel and more skeptical, you should be very well aware that all of these things can be manipulated or faked or changed or altered. That's not to say that they always are. That is a mistake that is commonly made by some of the armchair analysts, which is, that means that every single timestamp is fake. Every single C2 is somebody else's C2. Every single piece of code is somebody else's code. That's not the case, but they can be manipulated. So we're trying to keep some of this in mind. And we'd like to, rather than continue to discuss things in theory, we want to start to put some examples into common parlance. We want to put some examples out there for people to actually be able to hang their hat on this and say, this is an example of perhaps not entirely a false flag operation, not a successful event of somebody being entirely fooled that it was somebody else, but clear cases of manipulation by advanced threat actors of some of the things that we've been discussing, or all of the things that we've been discussing. Now, in order to do that, I need you to give me something. I need your help. We are an attribution agnostic company, and I fully believe that. As part of our research team, I think that we do this on purpose. We do it for good reason, and for any of you who watch this talk or read the paper, hopefully it'll become evident why we do that. That said, in order for me to tell you that something was a false flag, you also have to allow me to say, hey, this is believed to be a Ukrainian operation or a Colombian operation. And they pulled they pulled something over our eyes and they tried to make us believe they were from somewhere else. So in order to do that, I'm asking you to allow us to make some of these claims as if they're rumored. They're rumors, they're part of what you hear through the attribution grapevine, and not to attribute them to us directly. We'll tell you when we feel that we've got something going there, but we're not saying that these operations come from there for reasons that I think will become exceedingly obvious.
Okay, so let's get into the good stuff. The first APT group that we're going to talk about is Cloud Atlas. A lot of people know them as Inception. Blue Coat wrote a fantastic paper on it, and then a few others have actually written some good stuff too. But just to go into a couple details about them at first, we personally at Kaspersky and some others also believe that this is a spin-off from Red October. Red October was traditionally considered a Russian group or maybe a joint effort between Russia and Ukraine potentially. And then after some things started happening, Cloud Atlas kind of showed up. These guys are usually considered to be Eastern European based. Some people will actually say that this is the Ukraine half of Red October potentially. I'm not going to say either way, but again, attribution grapevine. What's cool about them is they rely on cloud-based services for their C2 and their exfil, and they really, really enjoy messing with investigators. And a lot of their malware that they've created, they've purposely thrown in some of these false flags that Juan was just talking about, those little tidbits that can be manipulated. And they are still active today, but not as much. I've kind of lost track of them a little bit. We found some things here and there. But what's really cool is I kind of call them the turducken APT. It's, you know, it's like an onion as you peel back the layers. That's kind of funny, huh? So just to go through a couple things why we call them that. So at first when the attacks were discovered, the documents and the lures that were used in the attacks actually, they had Spanish metadata. Some of the content was in Spanish language. And in general, things were pointing towards, you know, potentially a Spanish APT, looking at maybe domestic targets within Spain. Then, as we found the mobile malware, specifically the BlackBerry and the Android versions, there was Arabic and Hindi strings actually embedded inside of that. So we're like, okay, Middle Eastern actor potentially that's targeting Spain, maybe that doesn't really fit the mold. Then we found this. And actually, this was pointed out, I think, by Blue Coat originally. But what's interesting about this phrase, which was embedded in another piece of malware, is that the word "the" is actually capitalized. Not many people capitalize the word "the" when you're referring to the Queen, except for maybe people that were up here on stage right before us. So, some of their C2s. So other than the cloud-based exfil stuff that they were doing, a lot of the rest of their C2s and a lot of their infrastructure they were using was actually comprised of home routers within South Korea that were popped. So again, you know, okay, we've got Korean C2s, we've got some kind of UK phrase, Hindi, Arabic, Spanish. This is the really cool part. So they were monitoring their exfil and their victims. And what they were doing was, as the exfil was happening, they were deploying their stage 2 based on the victim. Well, a lot of researchers caught wind of this, and they started playing with the malware, and they started going into, you know, the cloud-based services. Well, what these guys did instead was when they saw a potential researcher come in, instead of deploying the real stage 2, they actually threw a piece of Chinese malware out there instead. So it was kind of like a big FU to everybody. And obviously, it looked like they were purposely setting their system clocks different every time they would compile malware. So that whole trend analysis of work hours based on compile times actually went out the window on that. So, yeah.
So that's let's say that's fairly simple in some ways, especially the things about strings. You can obviously put whatever strings you want in a binary and switch languages and so on and so forth. And that's something that also happened with Wild Neutron. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Wild Neutron or Morpho or Butterfly, depending on who you follow, who your favorite vendor is. They had, in some of their malware, they had Romanian strings for goodbye. They have some transliteration of Russian. And that's not really what's interesting about them. Because let's get away from the strings thing. Strings are cool, but obviously anybody can manipulate that. Instead, let's talk about something that essentially breaks down the paradigm of how we understand some of these threat actors. A lot of our understanding of different threat actors and how they correlate to geopolitical tensions and situations has to do with tasking and targeting. At the end of the day, a cyber operation is going to map onto some tension, some conflict in the real world that you can't hide, that you can't necessarily alter, and that everybody most likely knows about. Everybody knows that there is a tension between Israel and Iran and like different countries that are having some sort of, they've got some skin in the game, and chances are cyber operations are going to become involved as well. So it feels fairly easy for certain analysts, especially the ones that come from the real, from the IC and the Intel space, to say, well, if we can map a similar relationship between attackers and victims, then clearly we must be seeing some organization that belongs to one of these countries carrying out that conflict in cyberspace. However, there is a different kind of threat actor that hasn't been discussed very much that breaks that entire paradigm down. And that is the mercenary actor. Once you look at someone like Wild Neutron, which is actually one of my favorites, especially when it comes to the notion of false flags, these guys were very intimately aware of researchers. They were very aware of how some of these things were investigated. They were quite elite in their own way and had some 0 days and some interesting toolkits. But beyond all of that, they led people on a merry chase of who might actually be behind this operation. And once you tried to rely on the old method of looking at some of the victimology and some of the targets in order to understand who they might be, the whole thing falls apart because there is a nexus of financial interest. I mean, they were going after mergers and acquisitions companies. They were going after a lot of IT firms, companies that were about to IPO. So obviously you can say, okay, well, there's some financial interest. But then they were also going after law firms. They were interested in investment companies. They were interested in larger companies like Apple and Microsoft, Twitter, which, is kind of interesting but doesn't quite fit the mold. Then they were going after healthcare companies and individual users. And then all of a sudden we find that they were also involved in operations, in counterterrorism operations, which essentially breaks the mold of just the financially motivated attacker or just the criminal attacker or just a politically motivated attacker, because they didn't hit any government institutions or diplomatic institutions, but they went after counterterrorism targets. So if you think about Wild Neutron as a mercenary threat actor, it essentially takes the wind out of your sails when considering the possibility of just looking at tasking and being able to figure out what they're actually interested in. Now, let's move on to something different. So rather than just saying, okay, we can't quite tell where you're coming from, what happens when actors start to purposefully try to point you in the wrong direction? So the first example, larger trend of that we want to talk about, and it's become that much more important since we wrote the paper about 9 months ago, is the idea of APT actors trying to point at lesser actors, like hacktivists. I think you can see where I'm starting to go with this. When we started to write this, it was not well accepted in the research community. It was an uncomfortable idea. So we're going to give you a weak version of that and then the strong version of that. The weak version of that is the Lazarus Group. A lot of you will probably know them from the infamous Sony hack. Despite many ridiculous cyber truther claims, it's a fairly well-established group. They've been acting since about 2008 with different malware families, but a lot of things that you can technically trace back to a giant cluster of activity. They didn't just pop out of nowhere. However, what led some of that confusion was that they have this tendency to stand up fake hacktivism groups for all of their different operations. Now, I say that this is the weak version of doing this because there's no pedigree. They stand up hacktivist fronts that have never been active in forums, don't have a following, have never actually hacked a website before, have never leaked anything before, and all of a sudden they conduct a really large-scale, notorious operation with some ridiculous, flimsy ransom note from like the new Romanian cyber army, the new romantic cyber army, the Who Am I crew, the Guardians of Peace, which confuses reporters for about 6 hours, and then everybody goes back to the more obvious theory about where these guys might be from. The strong version of that, the fanciest version of that,
is my baby. Yeah, so we'll talk about the 800-pound elephant or bear in the room right now. So yeah, Sophisy. Hopefully everybody understands who this actor is. The last 8 months or so have been a pretty crazy wild ride, especially working for who we work for. But yeah, just to go through the actor real quick, traditionally most people consider these guys to be Russian-based. They've got a huge amount of resources. They drop O-days like a Pez dispenser. I've never seen an APT group just carelessly toss O-days out left and right. I think we found 3 in 1 month at one point. What's cool about them is their targeting has expanded, and it includes domestic and foreign media, counterterrorism, which is not traditionally falls under an espionage group, for example, as well as the typical foreign intelligence organizations and dissidents as well. Huge infrastructure, lots of resources, like I said. The best part about these guys is they love to jack with people. So we've changed these slides up a little bit because previously we actually went through 3 of the different personas and kind of went through in great detail the way we did in the paper. Unfortunately, because of the summer and all the crap that happened, there's just a huge amount of information. We can't possibly cover it all. So I have 3 slides. The first one, we just want to kind of show what happened with this group. Up until early 2015, that should say pre-2015, Sophisy was your traditional cyber espionage actor. They were pretty quiet. They were careful with their OPSEC. If they thought that they were being caught, they would back out of a system or move on to the next victim. Around 2015, we started seeing some kind of mess ups on their part, and it made a lot of us scratch our heads, like, why would these guys that used to be pretty good, why are they doing this? They got really brazen. They would understand that people were watching them. They knew they were caught, but yet they would still smash and grab and leave, walk right out the front door. They just didn't care. Their OPSEC got really, really lazy. So they also expanded their targeting. It used to be government, traditional espionage type organizations. Then they expanded out to the foreign and domestic media. They started targeting dissidents. They went into counterterrorism. More recently, they've actually hit two election cycles or democratic elections. Most people understand the one. There was actually another one before that. So, and their deception operations began right around this time. And early 2015 to June-ish, there was some issues going on. Everybody's familiar with the Ukraine conflict. Also, the Russian economy, in particular, just completely tanked around June of 2015. Whether or not these changes in TTPs were because of that or possibly operational tempo, don't know, but there was a definite major shift right around that time frame. So, targets. What I wanted to do here was, a lot of people understand or have heard probably most of these, but to see them all on one page on who they've hit in the last couple years, it's pretty mind-blowing. These guys have been crazy active. They've been hammering anybody that they want, and basically nothing's being done. So at first they started with Ukraine. They hit the government. They hit the election committee. They went after critical infrastructure. They hit billboards. They blocked cell phone calls from government representatives. They just basically caused mass chaos within Ukraine during the conflict. Then they turned their attention to Germany. They've hit Bundestag and Parliament at least twice. And what's interesting is those occurred in the last year or so, maybe 2 years. The Germans, I believe, have an election coming up this year in 2017. So keep note, maybe in a few months we'll see something different. What was really cool at one point was the Polish president publicly said during the conflict in Ukraine, we're moving all of our troops up to the border with Poland and Russia because we're terrified about what's going to happen. These guys are acting crazy, we don't know, so we're posturing ourselves to try to avoid conflict. 3 days later, Sofosy turned around and hacked the Warsaw Stock Exchange and published it as Cyber Caliphate. And basically, it was a big middle finger to Poland for moving their troops to the border. Then they turned their attention to media outlets. The most important one people understand, I think, is the TV5 Mond incident, where they were actually able to go in and shut down, I think it was like 10 or 12 stations nationally, or channels nationally, and actually broadcast ISIS propaganda. They hit a few media outlets in Maryland, I think in Arizona as well. Then they turned their attention to CENTCOM. They hit their Twitter account. They broadcast ISIS propaganda up on CENTCOM's Twitter account. Awesome. Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What we do know is that Sofosy actually did compromise Saudi MOFA, I believe it was February of 2015. Then in June of 2015, or May, Yemen Cyber Army, which we describe in the paper, actually published a bunch of leaked cables from Saudi Ministry. I don't know if the two are related, but I will just say that Sofosy definitely compromised them 3 months before this massive leak occurred through WikiLeaks and the Saudi leaks. The Olympics came around. Russia got hit with the doping scandal. All of a sudden, WADA, which is the Anti-Doping Administration, and TASCAS, which is the Court of Arbitration of Sport, ended up getting targeted. They were targeting actually athletes to gather credentials and then use those credentials to log in and get information to turn around and kind of slander other athletes. Then obviously in the summertime, we had DNC, DCCC, Podesta emails. We had the Bradley Foundation, which was targeted, and they actually modified some information to post out there to make it look like Bradley Foundation was contributing to the Clinton campaign in massive amounts of money. So if you look at that screen, they've been busy little bears. So some of the personas real quick to go through. Cyber Berkut. This was the Ukraine conflict, as well as I think maybe Bundestag. But basically, this was the supposed cyber arm of the secret police that was disbanded after Yanukovych was out of Ukraine. They created Cyber Caliphate. This was the cyber ISIS version that they were using to target US media, CENTCOM, all that stuff. Then we have YCA. That can be debated. I personally lean towards this being them. Some people claim it's Iranian. It could actually potentially be a combined effort. Don't know. Guccifer 2.0, DC Leaks was created, Fancy Bear's hack team, and @Anonymous Poland. All of these are personas that they've created in the last couple years. It's amazing the amount of resources that have to go into creating this stuff and maintain it and the infrastructure that's used. It's incredible. These guys are right now the best ones out there for this type of information.
Quick note on that last one. So we were aware of the WADA task casting just based on like domain registrations. We're already starting the report. And then if you can see that tiny, tiny tweet at the bottom, they used a bunch of bots to try to spread the news of their leak of the Bradley Foundation stuff and the TaskCast stuff. They started tweeting at me, at a bunch of other researchers, at Kurt, who works with us, Alex Gostev, a bunch of like media outlets and everything. So
I'm sorry, one more thing.
I'm on a Sophosy list.
Yeah,
somewhere.
this really gets my juices flowing. We just saw them 2 months ago, taking more documents from WADA, turning around and sending emails to journalists actually in Russia and other places and saying, hey, we've got this new leak from WADA. We have new information that we stole. Would you like to see it? And journalists are saying, yeah. And the information they're sending to the journalists is actually Trojanized. So now they're taking that information, turning it around and targeting domestic media with leaked information that they've stolen from somebody else. It's pretty amazing.
All right, so you got the big bad bear. I'll go through some of these very quickly. Rather than talking about an APT trying to throw the blame at a lower level actor like a hacktivist, what happens when, now that research is popular and all of us are so familiar with different TTPs for different threat actors, what happens when an APT actor decides to just cast the blame on a different APT threat actor? So a really weak version of that is the illest Dooku2, who we had such admiration for Dooku and put out so many blog posts and researched the original Dooku so much that they were kind enough to hand deliver the second version directly to our offices. So we had a great time researching this. Memory resident, tons, ODAs and like all this really cool network level understanding of a victim and so on. But if you look at the only thing that rests on disk, which is the kernel driver, the 32-bit version and the 64-bit version have different strings in them. One of them is Romanian anti-hacker, which I'll let you guess who that might have been in reference to. The other one was Ugly Gorilla, which is Wang Dong's handle from the APT1 report. It is actually patently ridiculous to consider that APT1 and Dooku2 are in any way related, mostly for code-based reasons, but also for every other reason. So this is like a really weak version of that. What's a cooler version of that? Tiger Milk. This is one of my babies that has never seen the light of day, sadly, but I will kind of like lift the veil a little bit so we can discuss it. It's a campaign that focused on targeting a single South American country for 6 months, mostly military and government institutions. The malware sucked. It was mostly meant to inject into the desktop and just try to steal some credentials. It was really just kind of like a first stage. We never actually got to see the next deployment. So why is this interesting at all? Well, for any of the nerds out there, the true geeks, does anybody recognize this digital certificate? If you can, look real close there. Anybody familiar with what this might be? You can shout it out. It is the exact same Stuxnet certificate, the one that was stolen from Realtek, presumably, and used for Stuxnet versions A and B. It was stolen for Stuxnet. It was never made public. More importantly, it was revoked and would have expired anyways, years before this operation. Tiger Milk happened in 2015. So there is literally zero technical gain from using that digital certificate for the malware. However, if what you're trying to do is misguide Peruvian incident responders into Googling some strings and thinking that, it was the big bad Stuxnet who is a friendly government, it might be worth your investment. So the real question here is, how the hell did they get it? I have no idea. So, you want to?
We can skip through this one.
Right.
Just real quick, Turla, skip through those slides. I think most people understand Turla. Faking Dragon was basically an incident where we recognized Turla on a victim machine, and once Turla caught wind that they were being looked at, they essentially deployed a fake TLS version of a rare, at the time, APT malware called Quarian. So anyway, long story short, they basically sent the researchers down this huge rabbit hole to come up with, the conclusion that, oh, this was Chinese-based. Meanwhile, they went in and deleted all their crap and backed out of the logs and moved on to other victims. So just another way of kind of redirecting researchers. And they're actually still using this technique. I just found something this week. They're doing the exact same thing today. So moving on to the more important part. So why are we doing this talk? If you get anything from the rest of this stuff, yes, we have 3 minutes, okay. If you get anything from this, take these things away. The first part is, what level of attribution do you need as a consumer? We kind of split this up into 3 different levels. You have the government, you've got private sector, and yes, you have media. So if you're the government, you obviously need the most fidelity in your attribution. Why? Because you're going to turn around and you're going to conduct cyber operations back at, say, the country of origin that conducted them at you. Or you're going to leverage sanctions, demarches, things like that, indictments. If you get into private sector, though, individual attribution, the person that did the attack, a picture of the guy with his kid riding his bicycle. It's not needed. It's sexy, yes, but what the hell? You don't need that. More importantly, you need country-level attribution. Where are your resources? Where are you doing business? If you're not doing business in China, do you really need to worry about Chinese threat actors? Don't know. Maybe you do, but something to think about. The last part, which irritates me a little bit, is the media. When you talk to the media, the first thing they ask you is basically, who was it? I want to know who it is. Give me a picture. They ask that, but at the same time, they don't ask the why. And as a journalist, if you're sitting in the audience, please, next time that you're talking to someone and you ask them who did it, make sure you follow up with, give me some information as to why you're saying this. It helps us all in the long run.
We're going to rush just through a few conclusions just so you can have some takeaways here. Some of these things have been discussed over the past day. Basically, keep in mind, threat intelligence is not IT or IR. I know that some of this was discussed yesterday in the chalet with the hot cocoa and everybody was friendly and everybody was cool. But there is something that threat intelligence is doing that these other disciplines aren't necessarily doing. And honestly, it's about perspective and experience, but more importantly, it's about historical context. The reason that you can tell that these things don't really fit the mold is because you have a historical awareness of the TTPs and how these threat actors are functioning, what they do, what these toolkits are, where they've been, and where they should and shouldn't be. And that's something that threat intel is going to do for you that other disciplines cannot do for you. Also, there are uniquely positioned entities to do attribution. We are not those entities. Chances are you are not those entities. Keep that in mind when somebody comes and tries to sell you an attribution claim. Also, when they try to tell you attribution is impossible, that's not necessarily the case. The SIGINT giants, the gods on the wires, have a much greater ability to do this. At the same time, they are the Cassandras of the modern age. If they tell you what they know, nobody will believe them because they can't substantiate it publicly. So keep that in mind.
Finally, a couple takeaways. As consumers, for example, just ask yourself a couple of these questions. So the first one is, hacking back, active defense, things like that. What happens with that technique or that thought if you really, as we just showed, can't necessarily pinpoint your target? Keep that in mind. Are you willing to stick your neck out there and actually do some of this stuff that some people are doing? Again, what extent do you need that attribution? Try to remember, do I need country-level specific things, where to direct my resources, or do I actually need individual stuff? Or do I need attribution at all? Right? Do I just need the cluster groups? Do I just need to know that this was SOFAC? I really don't care if it's GRU or if it's FSB or whoever. Just that it's this group, it's this threat actor that people, this nebulous thing that people have defined. The last part, obviously, if you're producing intelligence, please, please, please ask yourself, what actionable intelligence are you giving the consumer? If you're just going out there and putting these reports on the internet, and putting fancy pictures and awesome claims or just arguing for sake of arguing and not providing any real facts or any IOCs or anything that the consumer can use to turn around and defend their stuff, then you shouldn't be producing it in the first place, and shame on you.